Today we are sponsored by Orion Solutions Group, where experts place experts. Professional recruiting, project delivery, and contract staffing at your fingertips. Go to orionsolutionsgroup.com and get your position filled today. You know, today, everybody, we've got an opportunity to bring on board once again and speak with a few minutes to my right-hand person, the one that makes it all tick and all talk, the mechanics of the Swiss-made watch that is CJ Solutions Group, Jennifer Joslyn. I hear a roar in the background, cheering everywhere.
Thank you
Well,
for having
you know,
me.
I would say there's cheering, and then there's, you know, you kind of feel like you're ready to give an acceptance speech or something, and that's kind of apropos for the last day and a half worth of craziness in the country, which happens every 2 years now. It's like a continual episode of it's like a soap opera that I see going on.
There's nothing like some midterms right before the holidays, you know? It's really brings the cheer right to the dinner table around Thanksgiving time. So
well, it
everyone
depends on
loves
your dinner
to
table,
just
I
agree.
suppose, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, thank you for having me. Again, obviously I'm working from home right now. It is raining outside. I have a sweater on, so I'm really comfy and cozy for this.
Well, good.
Brief discussion.
Get the fireplace going and, you know, sit by, have a fireside chat, sticking with the political theme. That was, do you know which president started that, by the way, the fireside chat?
Oh, I might embarrass myself if I guess.
Well, it was well before your time, well before my time. So that should give you some indication. And if it's
FDR?
a fireside, there you go. I was going to say, if it's a fireside chat, then it has to be within the time. Whoops, got my camera moving all over the place here. It has to be within the time period of television. So FDR, I believe, and I could be wrong on that, but I believe he was the one that started the fireside chats originally. You know what? I could be wrong on that, though. But we'll have to get with our technical analyst and try to look up the Wikipedia version on that some other time. But I wanted to bring you on today to try to get to just have a little conversation, kind of an off the cuff, you know, chat, as it were. And we do that often about a lot of subjects. But in terms of politics, this is not a political show, of course. It is, you know, on the iLevelLogistics.com website, a community of transportation professionals inside and outside the transportation industry, those that are interested, those that are gaining knowledge and being part of the community, part of the answer, part of the solution instead of part of the problem, as you were.
Right.
I kind of consider us part of both most of the time. But when we have conversations like this, we kind of ferret out some things that may be helpful to those in the industry, those learning more about what's going on. And as much as people, I was on LinkedIn earlier today, and somebody was mentioning an affiliation with a particular political figure. And there was a lot of exchange back and forth between that person and some of the comments that were going on. And there was not a consensus on anything, of course, there never is. That's part of the wonderful part of the First Amendment and the country we live in. But one of the things that was said exactly quite often was that LinkedIn is not a place for political rhetoric or diatribe or conversation. And I kind of laughed at that because it's infiltrated literally every part of our lives these days. And that does not exclude the transportation logistics industry. There's a huge part of what goes on an everyday basis for those that work in the industry, whether it's the international transport side, steamship lines, whether it's if you're working on a port of entry or exit into and out of the North America, whether you're working on, you know, certifications or regulations or the railroads and the possibility of strikes or no strike, or whether you're working with labor unions, whatever the case may be, they're all tied into the politics of the day. And one of the things that we've noticed, at least I've noticed, and I kind of wanted to get your take on, Jen, was that this red trickle, if you will, or I think I saw a comment, it went from the red wave to the red wedding, for those of you that are what's
Game
the
of
name
Thrones
of that?
fans.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
which was at that time a very shocking episode to all of us that were watching it for the first time. We're like, what? That's kind of the way it felt in a way, depending on what side of the aisle you are on. But the thing about what happened last night is, even though there may be a change in some of the overall tenuous balance of power in Washington based on this midterm. What can be seen quite clearly is that the speed of transition for our industry and others toward a renewable economy is not going to slow down. There was no pushback against the current administration in the amount of money in time and energy and policy that is being thrown in that direction. So I think that the message that I kind of wanted to talk to you about was what your feelings were on that subject, not the politics of it, but the direction of it based on what you see happening in the last day or two.
Well, when it comes to like the renewable energy conversation, that is a huge conversation in politics today. And I think drives a lot of the regulation in supply chain, transportation, logistics era, so to speak. There is almost a middle ground that is non-existent at this point. And there seems to be all aisles fighting for a more sustainable future. You know, you have people who say someone like Elon Musk, who owns and has created Tesla, one of the most popular electric vehicle brands, being lobbied as, you know, whatever you think of him, as almost a right-wing guy, which is, considering how right wing is often correlated with, you know, anti-sustainable fuel sources. It's, you know, it's a funny little game of song and dance there. However, again, not to dive too much into the politics of it, but I think most people do recognize there needs to be some sort of change. I guess the question is whether you're someone who thinks there's been a lot and enough already, and whether the pros and cons of continuing to push that envelope as far as they possibly can really help or hurt the future, as opposed to those who say there's so much more progress to be had. Why stop when the ball's already rolling down the hill? So, you know, there's where the biggest contraction is, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right on the nose with a lot of that. A lot of people say, you know, there's an inevitability on a lot of the things that have been started, right? The ball is rolling downhill. That snowball that's going to turn into a giant avalanche is already on its way. Maybe that's a wrong analogy because the avalanche kind of is destructive in nature. Maybe more of the push for, lack of a better way to put it, the change in the way we view our relationship with the earth we live on is changing rapidly, and should it go slow or should it go fast? Now, you're of a different generation than me, obviously. And I suspect that parts of you feel the allure of change toward a, I wanted to say ethical, but maybe that's the wrong word, a change towards something that seems to be more nurturing and holistic for you know, the people around us than someone like myself who says, hold it here. We got to where we are because of the technologies and the changes we've made to create the industry out of really fossil fuels. And maybe change is inevitable, but maybe it should be done more slowly. You know, that's kind of always the way I've thought of incrementalist.
I think that the biggest question comes down to, would that momentum of, again, that ball rolling down the hill, would be stopping it be more destructive? Or again, would it be this positive thing in the end, or an avalanche is the way you were describing as sort of a negative connotation to it? And that's where the debate really lies, because, you know, I'm someone, I definitely think there are always better ways to improve as a society, right? Unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to find that perfection that we always strive for, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't. However, the biggest question also for me personally is, how can we do this in a way where it's not so painful? In the same sense, it also depends on what you qualify as painful for you and your family. Someone who lives, you know, relatively well off in a beautiful area of the country, like Southern California, for example, they have the financial resources, they have some sort of infrastructure there, is obviously in my opinion, going to be more likely to easily adapt to something like electric vehicles, solar panels, and other clean renewable energy sources than maybe someone who lives somewhere where those are not as easily accessible to them otherwise. So the question really comes down to, who are you willing to let suffer a little longer? And unfortunately, that's the question you have to sort of pose for almost every big change, because change is painful. And it really depends on what you're willing to put first.
Well, I think you've hit on something that's really interesting, because there's any change requires some sacrifice, right? It just doesn't happen by itself. I mean, things outside influence or inside, consternation creates change. There's an old saying, should we change for change's sake, right? Or, if it ain't broke, why fix it kind of philosophy is versus something like, we're inevitably in need of these kinds of changes, so why not make them happen, and understand that if we've had so much influx of prosperity in the last 50 years in North America, why shouldn't we use some of that prosperity and reel it back in to change things for the betterment of all around? So I get the philosophical argument. I really do. I think the challenge is that a lot of these changes tend to be pushed from above, then argued for and justified and agreed upon. So when you see,
I think that's.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I'll follow up because it's a bit of a long point, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, you see from, the way you kind of gauge these things and measure them a lot of times is through the political mechanism of voting, right? So you have people that are advocating for one thing versus another. And if you have 14 different options, and one of my opinions is that you should be able to vote for, let's say there's 5 candidates for an office. My preference would be to prioritize those 1 through 5 and weight those votes in that way. Because what we have now with the 2-party system is we have a situation where you end up voting for the lesser of 2 evils. And the side that wins, one side or the other, doesn't matter which one we're talking about, believes that they have some license to do all the most radical of those things that party believes in, or at least a fringe of that party believes in. So things don't fall to the center where most of us live. Things end up being pushed in a way that is kind of difficult to digest. That's kind of my point.
Yeah. You're a fan of Yellowstone, the TV show, I imagine.
Yeah.
There is a character on the show, and she was talking to another character. Not going to go into specifics, spoiler-wise. However, she says to this other character that running for office is a whole different ballgame than actually being in office. And she's trying to make the point, at least in her character's position, that when I'm in office, you try to keep the trust of the people. Your whole point is staying there. But when you're running, you win at all costs. It doesn't matter what you have to do to win, what you have to promise, what you have to say, who do you have to crush to get to where you're going. And unfortunately, I know it's a TV show. It's a fictional TV show. However, it was just a poignant little line that she had said. I did not say it word for word, but I think it really put into perspective, right, left, middle, whoever you are in the political realm, there are a lot of differences between what's run upon and what's done when they actually.
Well, I can imagine from that character that the actual verbiage was slightly different than you just. I know what you're talking about there, but it's interesting because sometimes you watch shows and they're caricatures of reality. But what's happened is there's been this feedback loop that these things have become more than just caricatures. Does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? And I think it's circular these days. I mean, that's why you see popular figures, populist and popular figures getting involved in all kinds of things that are just not in their bailiwick. And I remember, back, and this was a long time ago, I remember when Reagan became president, everybody was like, hold it, he's an actor. What is he doing this? And that was a very large anomaly at the time. Well, kind of normal these days, right? We've had everybody from Schwarzenegger to Trump in places that
Dr. Oz.
Well, he did, he got beat out by
tried.
Yeah. Well, we could go into there's a lot of interesting political angles we could take on this, but trying to bring it back to where we live, where we work, is how this affects transportation logistics. So I think that the measure I'm trying to get is anything that you thought might slow down on transitional economy issues, on regulatory issues, on spending issues toward conversion of different types of energy into renewable energies, to all the way to the idea of ESG becoming more prolific. Environmental, social, and governance, ESG, which is a measurement that people use for businesses these days to allow them to qualify.
Many software platforms are being unveiled to be as a database for ESG goals and how well they're met, so that suppliers can be sort of handpicked. For example, Amazon, I believe, wants to be a net zero carbon emissions company by 2040. So that means that company is going to have to be very selective with its suppliers, because their suppliers are part of their network. So that means also that if you are someone who is greatly reliant on Amazon for a huge chunk of your business, you better fall in line with those same ESG requirements. Yeah. One thing that there was an article, I believe it came out either today or yesterday, from CNBC. It was talking about particularly the electrical grid, because as a nation, I think it's pretty obvious that we are pushing for electrification, at least on not the whole scale, a very, very grand scheme. I mean, California, I think Massachusetts, a couple other states, likely to be more within the next 2 or 3 years, have approved the ban of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. And that means we're going to be focusing on electrical. Now, critics of that often reference the electrical grid in America not being sustainable enough at this point to withstand that kind of pressure and that amount of people on it all the time. Blackouts are much more common in America than they've been in the past couple decades. I think on average, each American experienced about 8 hours of blackouts in the past year. This is all from that CNBC article. And one thing they were talking about, although through the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA Act that the Biden administration passed recently, which has these huge tax incentives for companies to push for green, clean energy, renewable energy type resources instead of coal and gas and that sort of thing. Although that's all well said and done, there is a field of red tape, regardless, that needs to be crossed. And that is the challenge America is going to face over what I speculate, at least the next decade, as we move forward to try and accomplish those admirable but very lofty goals that places like Amazon and California as a whole are really pushing for. Because there is a lot more to be said than done than just, cutting something off and doing nothing else.
Well, I think in the transportation sector in particular, this has a lot of application. Both of us got our chops in business in Southern California for the most part. And we see them as I always often like to say, the tip of the spear on a lot of these issues. And They continue to be. And matter of fact, I've seen a lot of ads for them. The California Air Resource Board hiring a lot of people for enforcement, not for analytics or anything like that, but for enforcement of the policies that are put in place, like the indirect source rule, things like that are applicable to these large companies. And these large companies are smart enough to utilize a portion of their budget to move into this ESG world. And in doing so, they're creating a downstream effect on all the quote unquote minor vendors that are used in facilitating, their entire supply chain. Mm-hmm. If those minor vendors don't acquiesce or somehow figure out how to utilize government subsidies to get into the renewable side of things and get to zero emissions by a certain threshold, then they're not going to be participating with those. There might be niche business still around, et cetera. And the ports are a great example of that. They're already instituting zero emission not possibilities. They've got mandates on a certain date and time as well. I was talking to the guy from ATA not too long ago about this very subject. And while you could hear frustration in his voice, there's also a sense of, maybe this is the wrong word, but resignation that these things are inevitably going to happen. And but to your point, will the infrastructure facilitate this? Or is it one of those things where we have one of those pain points we all have to suffer is rolling brownouts all the time and not charging up your car in your garage during certain times of the day because you might, put the lights out for your neighborhood?
Well, I think that's already a problem. I mean, I'm from San Diego County, so are you. That was a common problem SDG&E had after especially some really difficult wildfire seasons and, trying to avoid any sort of devastating consequences like death and all destruction to the wildlife and things like that. They would have to turn off the power certain times, whether heat, wind, or otherwise storms, just to keep everyone safe. Again, that there's a cost associated with that. You turn the power off to keep us safe, but maybe your food goes rotten. Maybe you can't get to work because you have an electric car and you can't plug your car. There's all sorts of costs associated versus, pros and cons. There's a pros and cons list here, and people disagree on what's a pro and what's a con. And again, this might be not an issue for someone who maybe in my position works from home and doesn't have to leave my house to get to my job, as opposed to someone who perhaps they even take public transportation. A lot of cities are working on electrical vehicles in their public transportation, electric trains, electric buses. I believe electric school buses are a huge major push right now for kids getting to school. And those are, huge accomplishments, but at the same time, there's always a cost associated. There's always a what if. I guess it just depends on who's looking at the situation and says, is this what if worth putting a stop to it or putting the foot all the way down to the floor on the pedal? And sometimes I'm someone who tends to believe that you just kind of edge on it, but,
Well, it's interesting. I'm an advocate of continuous improvement projects. I early on in my career, I was dealing with Toyota quite a bit. And they have, matter of fact, there was a book originally by their founder called Toyota Way. It relies specifically on looking at efficiency efforts over time for even very, very things that you wouldn't even think about on a manufacturing floor, for instance, how employees would walk from one area to another and to increase their ability to be efficient with their manufacturing process. As an example, Six Sigma kind of grew out of that same philosophy as well. It's all about continuing to improve, continuing to look back over what you did, analyze it, understand it, learn from it, and grow from it. So I'm all for that. The challenge is that somebody right now seems to be like tossing one book out and just bringing in another, right? The whole, knock the building down and build another instead of using the bones that it has to create something new. So we could debate that quite a bit. And I think anybody listening to this can probably guess where my proclivities lay. But at the same time, I look at it overall and I'm like, you can only swim upstream so much before you drown. Right. You get worn out and you lose traction. You better float with the rest of the river or you're not going to make it. And I think one of the things that the most recent politics has done in my mind is it's told me that it's time to do not an about face, but a reconciliation of my thoughts on where we're headed in the next 10, 15 years in terms of what we do, because it's going to be radically different. How we absorb the costs for those change, I'll tell you exactly how we do it. It rolls downhill to everybody buying something at a store. That's where it always rolls downhill too.
Well, it's already rolled down that way. And, if you've been paying any attention, obviously we all know about inflation and how it's felt, in whether you're paying rent or trying to buy a house or just filling up your car at a gas station. Obviously that's been felt by everyone. But there's also the little things that maybe we haven't been paying attention to. For example, that same meal at your favorite restaurant that you've been having for the past decade costs more and is also smaller. There's less food on your plate and you're paying, $5 more than you were before. And again, this is just pure economics. That's what inflation is. And that has been coined as shrinkflation. That's the fun little economic term for that. Same with stores. You'll look at the bag of potato chips and you'll realize, wait, that's a little smaller and more expensive than I remember it being. But when it comes to the facing this green energy, clean energy transition, and think about it, solar panels, for example, solar energy is probably the cheapest renewable energy we have at this point. Places like the European Union, they've been just, loading up the area. They're also facing a serious energy crisis when it comes to, cutting off Nord Stream 2, everything going on with Russia invading Ukraine, and, all of the stuff that aligns with that has put the European Union in a very, very tight situation, making sure that they meet their goals for energy at the same time, not having much to fall back on. So they've sort of put themselves in a real corner. Right. And, I'm not from the European Union, but best of luck to them and everything they've been doing. But one thing when it comes to solar energy, and same with wind energy, wind turbines, these huge farms of, the solar panel farm that you see on the way to Las Vegas from Southern California. Anyone who's done that drive knows exactly what I'm talking about. The one where people say birds fly over and they just get zapped by the sun.
They just disappear.
Yeah. So these solar panels and these wind turbines, right now we're focusing a lot on offshore wind turbines. The Biden administration has, allocated a lot of money towards that. The biggest issue is finding the space to do these huge, huge projects, because these farms require, I think it was something like 800 times the amount of space that a regular gas would need per unit. To make the same type of energy. It's just clean. So you need more space. And there are wide swaths of land available in the United States, offshore, onshore. However, how willing are people to buy up that huge amount of land with expense? You got to put plumbing in there so someone can work on the field. Like there's a lot of little bits and pieces that aren't initially thought about when you have these big projects. Doesn't mean they're impossible. Doesn't even mean they're necessarily the wrong move. It's just not always as easy as 1, 2, 3. Unfortunately.
The one of the interesting and probably most exciting things about a lot of this, though, is that if you look back, if you're a historian or even quasi one that likes to look at documentaries on certain historical things or how we become a civilized country or world in the last 100 years, you see dramatic, and I mean incredibly dramatic changes that occur within 10 to 15 year periods where, you'd look back and you go, this technology literally changed everything about what we do. That's kind of where we're at. That is an exciting thing because technology does get better. Every time we come near some cataclysmic or existential, whether real or perceived crisis in our world, in our civilization, somebody comes up with technologies that with enough applied energy and money, they come into fruition. They come into being. And they may look big and ugly to begin with, like a lot of these wind farms. I'm not an advocate for giant wind farms everywhere. I think they're, and who knows what you're going to do with those turbines when they're gone, right? Build reefs for the fish. Who knows? Somebody will come up with something, right? But in the meantime, it's very volatile. And I think going back and trying to finish this up, this goes back to what you said a few minutes ago. How much pain is everybody willing to put up with? Well, circling back to the very beginning, apparently quite a bit, or we would have seen different results in the election process on the 8th.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that just one way to put a positive spin on what we've been able to do in probably about the last 10 years, particularly, is just a personal example to me as being someone from Southern California. They have some very expensive gas. Yes, I know. It's extremely expensive, most expensive in the country. And a lot of that has to do with taxes and everything, but it's also the way that California requires their gasoline to be refined. If you look at the skies of Los Angeles today, one of the most crowded places in America where there is not the best amount of public transportation, so there's a lot of cars on the road, and vast majority of them are not electric or hybrid. The skies look so much better than they did 10 years ago. And I think that's a testament to we haven't done nothing as a nation for 10 years. And we've done a lot. And that's commendable. If you're someone who believes we should do more or less, that's a conversation for you and whoever wants to either argue with you or agree with you. I'm not here to do that today. However, it's important to remember that we've been getting there. And thank God we've done some. And now we get to see if we continue to move forward or if we scale back and figure out how we can get ourselves out of some other messes that our nation has found itself in the last, couple of years.
And trust me, there's always more messes to come. That's one of the things in our nature, apparently, is that for every one we solve, we create a few more messes, right? So there's always something for us to think about and do. But, Jen, I really appreciate you spending a few minutes chatting about this. I know we didn't solve anything at all, but I thought it was interesting to kind of get your take on some of this and how we all move forward together.
Agreed. Thank you so much for having me.